community. So welcome everybody, my name is Morten, I'm from UNU eGov. I'll be moderating the next 19 minutes. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes because we see that the coffee breaks are still on, but then we'll line up. Just a little bit of household. We'll have an online moderator, so please don't hesitate to put questions or observations into the chat, and Carmen, our colleague, will chime in when she's prompted with highlighting some of the questions and observations that we can then discuss in this panel. We will have a couple of rounds of discussion. We will start with the panel, obviously, but we'll subsequently open up the floor both here in Lillestrøm and online. Okay, I see some more people coming in, but let's get cracking. So again, welcome to this open forum. We'll be looking at ways to advance digital inclusion through improved segmentation of data collection for better and more targeted decision making. We have a number of excellent panelists, two of which unfortunately will not join us. Helani from Lina Asia is unfortunately stuck somewhere in space because of issues with flights over the Middle East, and Valette Hamdi from the African Union's Information Systems Department unfortunately has similar challenges with getting from A to B due to some Middle Eastern conflict issues. So they sent their sincere apologies, but they will be commenting on the report and the feedback of this session after the fact. We have an excellent panel otherwise. We have from the far left, we have Guilherme, he's from UNESCO. Then we have Priya, she's from Research ICT Africa. We have Onika from the Global Digital Inclusion in Partnership, what is it, program?
GDIP.
GDIP. And then we have also Fabio from CETIC Brazil. And my name is Morten, I'll be basically facilitating. Now, a couple of things that I'd like to start to set the scene. I think we all agree the internet is not new. It's been around since, the previous millennium even, but really took off in the late 1990s, early 2000s. That said, about a third of the world's population is not yet meaningfully included in the World Wide Web or the opportunities of such. Now, we see that there's some segmentation differences on that. We see that generally the Global South, low-income households, rural areas, seniors, people who are in unique situations or have physical disabilities or even gender segmentation are factors in relation to that, and we'll dive into that. Similarly, we see that most frameworks promoting digital inclusion tend to recognize the problem, but not really measuring it. We see a little bit of a hen and an egg situation, that in communities that have the biggest potential community of excluded people are the ones that have the weakest data. This is particularly emerging economies, low-income countries in particular. We also see that these frameworks are often looking at annual assessment cycles. We've had some earlier workshops this week already with examples of how to increase that segmentation or those cycles to be more active in terms of giving quicker snapshots for decision makers to target their initiatives. But what they have in common is that they're still very much supply orientated, as in, have you used the internet in the last 12 months? Yes or no? limited focus on the type of activities, the type of demands that we're looking for in terms of gauging the inclusion or the degree of people's use of digital opportunities. So again, without this knowledge, how can we as decision makers from the public sector, the private sector, from civil society or research community, propose more targeted initiatives that meaningfully aim to include those who are not yet included? If we don't know who they are, where they live, or their features, how can we develop policy initiatives or charity initiatives or technical initiatives or capacity initiatives to get them included? So this is some of the elements that we are looking at in the coming hour and so, and we'll have an active discussion on. But let's get cracking with some questions to the panel. Guilherme, from the IFAP program at UNESCO, you're developing a set of data segments to monitor not just digital inclusion or exclusion, but also other things. But how do UNESCO promote that as a global standard? And what are the type of things that you find is really interesting to compare across different national context or socioeconomic context from your perspective? And do you have an example of how that has led to better policy initiatives?
Thank you, Martin. I'm very glad to be here, first and foremost, because I do think these dynamic coalitions under the umbrella of IGF is also a sort of a multilateral policy concrete tool for these kind of interactions. If you see the members of this coalition, some of them are the speakers here, but many others that are not in this room necessarily, they provide different pieces to this puzzle. Therefore, these kind of discussions and also the concrete outputs that this can generate are already something very relevant for this. But on your concrete question, the Information for All program is an intergovernmental program under the umbrella of the broader UNESCO governing bodies. And of course, what the program does is to leverage the different aspects of the multilateral policy that is approved by our different governing bodies, our member states. So I could speak here a lot on different elements that could help to respond to your question. Let me take 2 or 3 examples that are in a way complementary. So the first one that's probably is more well known is the Internet Universality Indicators. That's something that was approved many years ago by all UNESCO member states, have been refined in different moments. I guess Fabio will speak about that. But that is a concrete set of indicators based on these 5 pillars: rights, openness, accessibility, multi-stakeholderism, and the X are several cross-cutting elements: gender, children, and so on. And so this is a concrete set of indicators proposed and validated by a multilateral organization like UNESCO, but it does not necessarily mean that UNESCO needs to apply it. What we are offering is something that then the different actors can use, either if they are governments and they want to use that to prepare and produce better policies, evidence-based, or if they are civil society that wants to hold governments accountable, to tell them, you are not doing what yourselves are saying in fora like in UNESCO in Paris or in the UN in New York or Geneva and so on. And then in some cases, we are invited by our member states to help with the implementation. So, but the first thing is this comprehensive set of indicators. I'm using the example of the ROM-X, but there are several other things connected with meaningful connectivity, sorry for the redundancy. For example, the RAMs, the Readiness Assessment Methodology for the information, the recommendation of ethics and AI. This is another concrete example. There are others in the area of the 2005 Convention connecting all these digital issues with the diversity of cultural expression. So this is one type of logic. The other type is when we have mandatory monitoring with our member states based on the things they have approved. So for example, there is a 2003 recommendation on the multilingualism on the cyberspace. We know that multilingualism is also a critical element of meaningful connectivity. So this recommendation, every 4 years, the member states need to report back to UNESCO what they are doing. So it's not a concrete data set per se, but what we collect from this mandatory exercise can become that and then be used by the different stakeholders as they see. For example, right now we are in the middle of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. This kind of data we collect through the 2003 recommendation or the World Atlas of Languages, etc., are fundamental for that. There are others, like the other recommendations like that. For example, there is one on documental heritage. So all the issues of preserving digital heritage, every 4 years, the member states also need to report back on that. And then finally, there is the guidance related to this need to keep monitoring and evaluating and producing, for example, risk assessments and so on. More recently, UNESCO launched this document that I'm sure several of you heard about, that is the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms. That document is suggesting concrete ways for the different stakeholders to produce risk assessments, to look into what's happening in the digital ecosystem from that perspective of protecting and promoting freedom of expression. So, in a nutshell, and I finish, we have a concrete set of indicators, we have the mandatory monitoring exercises, and we have this guidance for them. I could keep speaking here on different ways that this impacted reality, but I must say that in the 40 countries that already have implemented their own acts, several of them used this to change legislation, to then fulfill the gaps that were identified by the application of these kind of indicators, for example. The last thing I want to say to all of you is good news and bad news. The bad news is that I need to leave because I need to open another session. The good news is that this will offer more time for more intelligent people than myself to discuss with you. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Guilherme, and thank you for warning us before we started. Fully understandable that you're going to be hectic. I'll take the opportunity to quickly jump to another angle, and that's for you, Nika. So from the perspective of the GDIP, how can segmented data, particularly related to gender and things like affordability, safety and trust concerns, digital literacy, but also classical literacy, how can we be better at that? And what are you doing at the GDIP in order to promote that segmentation of data collection for better and more targeted decisions?
Yeah, good question. Thank you very much for that, and good day to everyone here and online. Our premier research that we've done in this area is the Connected Resilience report that looks at gendered experiences of women through meaningful connectivity, taking an approach of both quantitative research as well as qualitative, and doing some policy ethnography as well to really understand what's happening with women. This segmented framework actually became a powerful tool for us to be able to detect and address very gender-specific barriers that women are experiencing through meaningful connectivity, such as affordability, safety concerns, as well as digital literacy issues that came up quite strongly in that report. And ensuring that the programs that are then implemented truly focus on women and digital technologies are targeting the needs that women have identified to effectively address the inequities that exist in their connectivity. So I would just say 3 main areas for us that the segmentation actually has shown importance in is that it helps us to surface hidden gaps that we may not have otherwise been fully aware of, especially the qualitative approach. I think it helped us really truly understand what the hidden gaps may be. Taking, for example, the example of online safety. as well as monitoring and surveillance of women's activities online by sometimes family members. That's something that when you just do a regular survey, asking people, are you online, are you not online, all you would find out is that, no, I'm not online, but not really understanding what are the drivers behind that. It could be affordability, it could be safety, and more through qualitative focus on women specifically, we are finding all of these other hidden factors that influence their access, as well as being able to identify some very context-specific barriers. We tend to classify, for example, women as, just that one monolithic group, or even urban and rural. But what we are learning also is that there's an emerging divide amongst those who are already connected. It's not just about the ones who are connected and those who are offline, but including the ones that are connected, there is a difference in how they are connected, and being able to have a segmented approach in understanding the classifications around age, gender, income, rural, peri-urban. We tend to do this rural-urban, but peri-urban populations will tend to actually look closer to the experiences of rural communities because of resources and urban inequality that exists, especially when you look at a country like South Africa is a really good example where within the urban sector you can't just take the population as is, right? And then one other one that I want to highlight is, being able to tailor interventions and resources. You can't do that without having very specific, information from that particular population. National averages are just simply not serving women. They are not serving everyone else as well. And I'll give you an example from South Africa in particular, where we continue to be the most unequal society, with more than half of the population living on less than half average GNI. So anything around affordability that you are going to do in South Africa without stratifying the income quantiles, you are always going to get an overinflated outcome that does not fully represent those who are at the bottom of the income quantiles. And women also tend to be very much overrepresented in those lower levels of income. So in order for us to be able to recommend gender-specific and gender-responsive policy interventions, it's important for them to be informed by lived experiences of women. And that segmentation helps us with that.
And that leads me to a follow-up question, if we have a bit of extra time. So, have you got any good examples of where either your program has been able to do better recommendations for policymakers, or where policymakers have made better decisions, more targeted, pinpointing initiatives based on better segmented data for gender, for instance, or affordability in that context?
Yes, certainly. So one of the things that we did with the Connected Resilience Report is to introduce a method on that we termed policy ethnography, where we actually also brought policymakers together to understand how they make decisions and what informs them. So one particular country, and please allow me to withhold the name of the country, had gone out to build these digital centers in rural areas because women did not have their own personal devices at home and they did not have a way to connect. So the idea was that these digital centers that were actually funded through the Universal Service and Access Funds would enable women to be able to have access to, connectivity. And over time, they realized that women were just simply not going to these centers. And it was actually through assisting them to do stakeholder consultations and meet with women and be informed by women that we learned several things. One was that the hours that the center was available for just did not work for the women in that community who have to wake up very early, fetch wood, take care of children, get children to school, come back from the market before kids come back from school. But also the other issue was the issue of safety, for them to then walk in a direction that is not as well populated by people that they would feel comfortable walking past for them to be able to utilize the center. So it had very little to do with, whether they have the skills or interest or any of that. It was really predicated around their own safety and their own lived experience navigating that community that had not been factored into this huge investment of building the centers for, with the aim and purpose of women being able to use the centers to access. Okay. So we've got quite a few of similar examples in our report as well that just really shows how when you design for women and with women at the center, you have to actually design with them informing you so that they are part of that solution.
Yeah, excellent. We've spoken a bit about the South African context in the last example, so we'll move to another country that have similar challenges in some ways and similar success stories. But Fabio, CETIC Brazil is increasingly segmenting their data for the Brazilian context. We're talking about different types of segmentation already, but what are the ones that you're finding particularly useful for decision makers in Brazil, both at local but also at the regional, state or federal level? And is there a difference between the type of segments that those decision makers need in order to do better policy?
Thank you, Morten. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with partners in this discussion. Before answering to your question, I think it's interesting. Monica just was very comprehensive in making the case of the advantage of having this type of information. I'd like just to describe a little bit the institutional model that we have in Brazil that I think it's useful. And I think other governments are having this as a reference because, CETIC is a non-profit. It's based at NIC.br, which is a non-profit organization that is funded by the .br domain names registry. So we have a model that the authority for the .br, the NIC.br, is responsible for this service, this public interest services, and this allows us to have a specific center, which is CETIC.br, focusing on producing this type of data and sharing with policymakers. So this, I think, first of all, this strategy is allowing us to have the continuity of surveys and other type of research, and to making the case of the relevance of this for the government and the society as a whole. And another thing that is in our DNA that I think it's very relevant is that we are not only multi-stakeholder in the process of the organization, but we are also multi-stakeholder when we do research. So every time, and I think this is a useful thing for other experiences. Every time you will start an investigation, when you start a new survey, we invite what we call a group of experts around a multi-stakeholder group of people who will first define what to measure, what are the topics that we need to measure, what are the demand for data that we have in the government, in the private sector, in the other sectors. And so this is useful because we can adjust the data production to the demand of the decision makers, and this is very useful to us. And I just to mention that this type of agreement has growing relevance among governments. We have been participated in the G20 processes for the past 2 years. So last year we have the Brazilian presidency of the G20, and we supported, along with ITU, a report that was the G20 launched this report that was just connecting the idea of meaningful connectivity and the need for segmented monitoring. So in this, just to mention, in this report, we argued that we cannot only use to access, but we need to understand connection quality, availability for use, affordability, device, digital skills, and safety and security. So also in the G20 members recognizing that there are a lot of other dimensions that need to be monitored. And more importantly, that this data need to be disaggregated by demographic variables such as age, gender, household size, and others, economic variables like income, employment status, and others, and in geographic disaggregation, because you know that countries are also the digital inequalities is also expressed in the territory, and you can find differences between on this. So in this and in this year in 2025, we also, along with Research ICT Africa, we supported another paper on this discussion on the G20 South African presidency, and stressing a little bit more about the funding issues. How we need also to guarantee that countries have fund to do this type of research. So we can discuss more after the.
I think it's very interesting.
Just to say that this institutional and consultative part is very important for the discussion.
I think it's a very interesting. CETIC Brazil is a very interesting funding model. And it's a little bit of a sidetrack from the discussion, and we can maybe come back to it. But we see that often telco licensing and the auctioning leads to a logical profit maximization attempt from the government, particularly the Ministry of Finance. And I used to work for the Danish Ministry of Finance, so I have to put that disclaimer in. But it tends to often result in slower rollout of next generation technology. It then, after the license is secured, the telcos will want to make a profit. This is logical, but they will then sacrifice either the rollout of that technology or underserved, less attractive areas in remote areas, rural communities, urban communities that are not seen as profitable, or the price is the profit or the price is transferred to the customer, which is in fact, yes, helping the government to profit maximize, but kills other government objectives and targets for digital inclusion, affordability, and reliability. So there's some interesting elements, and the Universal Access Fund is often seen as an ability to try and then reinvest the profits from the license into that, like in CETIC's case for research, or in Tanzania, where it's then to fix gaps in the infrastructure in remote areas or increase the volume of hotspots or free Wi-Fi hotspots, etc., with all the pros and cons they have. So there's some interesting elements around that, but will data really help us in that regard? That is maybe more of an open question. Yeah. So a little bit of a sidetrack, but what are the type of tricks you have at CETIC in terms to nuance the data collection? Is there alternative sources rather than the classical, we go and collect, we do surveys, etc.? Are there any tricks to the trade, so to speak, from your perspective and your experience that could help increase the segmentation?
Yes, I think of course, methodological innovation can do a lot in this type of exercise. It's not surveys cannot take care of everything. So we are trying at CETIC to mix methods and to integrate more geospatial data and other sources of data to combine with surveys. I can give a few examples. For instance, in the field of connectivity in schools. NIC.br has a system that is called CMET, which is a system for a software that you install in anywhere you want to test the quality of the broadband of this organization or household or so on. And in agreement with the Ministry of Education, we put we installed this software in more than the 70,000 schools in the country, having real-time data on the quality of the connectivity, and we can cross this with the survey data that CETIC has also on what teachers are doing in the same schools and so on. So here's one example of you can combine different sources of information to provide more granular information. Another example that I like in terms of geographical disaggregation that I think is interesting, we we tend to think that the urban areas are always well connected, but this is not the case. If you take the number of disconnected, for instance, most of them are in urban areas very close to center, because the population is also concentrated in these areas. So we had one study that we did a few years ago that we could disaggregate, combining different sources of data. The city of São Paulo, which is the largest city in Brazil, you could disaggregate the data, combining social demographical and digital inequalities data. And then for instance, we understood that one particular neighborhood in the city tend to be very high connectivity, but low level of socioeconomic status. Well, what's happening there? So we can refine more. And we discovered that because there was a road passing through close to this area, across to different other sources, there was a there are a lot of young people living in this area, and young couples, and we could track the differences that we have in this particular area because of the data. So having this type of data, of course, you can lead to policies that are more attached and focus on different perspectives.
Excellent. Just to close the first round before we are open up to the floor also online. So Priya at Research ICT Africa, you're also working with segmented data, obviously. But what are some of the examples that, again, you find particularly useful for your research, but also for policy recommendation that your center is doing on a regular basis? And again, how does that become helpful in identifying these location or community-specific or user group-specific digital divides? Are they again around gender? Is it around income quartiles? Is it educational? What do you see from your perspective?
Yeah. No, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. For us, this work is core to our organization, and so we've been running for a number of years our after access research, where we've prioritized segmented data. So we collect data directly from individuals and households, and we ask them very specific questions. And I think our findings really reinforce what Annika mentioned about the value of qualitative analysis, and what Fabio mentioned about those insights that come from when you are uniquely able to combine the data. But we ask questions around their access. Do you have a smartphone, computer, broadband at home, or affordability? And then we also ask questions about their usage patterns. So what do they use the internet for? Is it social media, work, education, health, government services? And I think this is to combat some of the assumptions that we make about who's using what. We also ask questions about their preferred platforms. And then we ask questions about the level of digital literacy and skills that we're dealing with. And so, what are they able to do? And can they send emails, use online banking? And then some questions around trust. And I think that also reveals very, very specific nuances. And then, I think when it comes to the question of barriers, this is where that contextual information really, really becomes valuable. So we ask questions about, why don't you use the internet anymore? And is it because you don't have a need for it? Is it about safety concerns? And then, of course, in our data, we have that valuable demographic segmentation. So that's by gender, age, income level, education, location. Annika mentioned to include the peri-urban category in there, but also disability status and language as well. So this allows us to draw out very specific insights, and the work that we've been doing is now absorbed globally into UN reports by the ITU, OECD, and so on, and then more regionally to define indicators that are set for specific targets. So it's now producing, I think, for the continent, these insights that can never go away. So inputs into the ecosystem that just have to be long-standing. So at the very minimum, we can confirm that data costs are a primary barrier, but we can do that in a granular way. So in South Africa, 70% of our respondents cited affordability issues. When compared to Uganda, it was 61% that cited affordability. And we've got now some contrasts between the different countries. But then we also pull out these additional barriers, and one of them could be even just the lack of perceived need for some of the services that are on offer. And now we can get quite contextual about the association between what's on offer and the demand. The digital literacy gaps at a granular level, barriers such as electricity access, privacy concerns. And it brings out, I suppose, the multidimensional element that comes from these contextual nuances that isn't just about the segmentation, in fact, but in fact, these multidimensional qualities. And these insights, importantly, need to inform very specific recommendations. So I suppose the segmentation and the approach and the methodology, that's a big learning, but then how to present this information in a way in which it can be absorbed and utilized effectively. So we know that education and income, as Annika mentioned, are key drivers of digital access and use. But it means that we need targeted policies to address these. And our recommendations themselves need to be nuanced as to how this will actually take place and who would be the custodians of those kinds of efforts. So it broadens, in fact, our policy engagement audience. So while it's not strictly, I suppose, data samples, I think there's also that value, as Annika mentioned, in understanding the lived experiences, particularly in our contexts, where we're seeing this huge variation. We also need to understand attitudes across the ages and across the different segments, cultural barriers, specific use cases that draw particular people in. And then also what they consider trusted community channels. And are we exploiting that to the extent that we can? We know that cultural and linguistic barriers in schools with internet connectivity place additional constraints. So while we might have focused on getting schools connected, are we really seeing some of those linguistic barriers and those cultural barriers that are preventing children from being able to meaningfully leverage online services? And we also know that digital exclusion is now coming out of this data, and I suppose its longitudinal value is compounded when these factors intersect. And I suppose that's one of the challenges we take into this conversation, and I hope we return to the funding conversation, because that's an important one. But as we progress and as we get more adaptive in this space, I think we need to be able to deal with this data in a way in which we appreciate the value of the intersectional data that's coming out and the range of inequalities that we're seeing and how they intersect, especially for women, as Annika mentioned. But now we also know that there are intersections between drivers and barriers. So, for instance, young people in informal settlements access the internet through shared phones because they might be hungry for job content or, maybe to access bursaries, but they're also accessing it at much higher costs. And what do we do with that information? So it's I suppose, without sounding like a data geek, the data is very telling, but I suppose the challenge for us is what do we do with the data?
What I hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, from all of you, including Guilherme, and also reflects a little bit of the discussion we have internally at the office, is you can look at data in different levels. The national level data will be basically a heat map, the classical data. Have you used it for X, Y, Z? What's your feature? What's your user profile on a high level? Gives us a heat map that then allows us to say, oh, here we don't have to worry, everything is bright green. Here there's something going on, but let's wait and see. But here's something flashing red. We need to dive into that And based on that heat map, we know, okay, it seems to be around a socioeconomic fragment in this geographical region that has these type of inhabitants. And then we dive down and we look at the context and see what is it really going on. But it means that we can target our decision makers. So we layer our data and we dive in where we see the red lights flashing, so to speak, but where everything is green, we don't have to worry. Yeah? Is that correctly sort of pulled out on sort of the logic in terms of the data segmentation when it comes to the granularity? Or did I misunderstand you a little bit? Any thoughts?
I mean, I would say, more maybe to challenge it, that it's a dynamic space. And so I would also exercise caution around the green. And as you mentioned, I think when you started the session, you said there's value in the timing. And at the moment, the cycles, they're long. And so how long does the green stay green? Yeah. And what are the variations impacting the green? I mean, we've learned lessons coming out of the pandemic. So, you've got, so we have to be cautious with the green.
Oh, yeah,
say.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think at best, the segmentation just really allows us to be able to monitor, what's happening, but also to begin to think about frameworks of accountability, right? Because a lot of these divides happen within the context of a slew of policies that are there to drive inclusion, whether we are doing it using the Universal Service and Access Funds, or we have broadband policies that actually are very explicit about closing the digital divides. But, I think that this segmentation really helps us to be able to monitor, are we truly being effective? Are we being targeted in this? And what is the accountability framework after 20 years of having a broadband policy that says this, and yet the results on the ground look starkly different from that? It's not a silver bullet, I think as we were talking also about just how do we fund this data collection, I was just thinking about just sort of an underutilized resource that exists in data collection right now, but it's underutilized because it requires a lot of transformation. And that is national census data. Every 10 years, with no fail, most countries find money to collect national census data. But how many of us have engaged with the national census bureaus to get them to transform their line of questioning, to begin to collect even digital-related data? We're successful with Mozambique, but then once that happens, you have another challenge. So you've collected all this incredible data about use of digital technologies within the country. Then what? That's another resource to invest in analyzing the data and being able to make sure that it truly is utilized to inform intervention strategies, to inform policy making. So it's a continuous cycle. I think it's one of those where we have to continue to walk while chewing gum at the same time.
I'm smiling because I was studying in the UK back in 1999-2000, and I was counted twice for the census back then because I happened to have been on 2 different addresses when they came knocking on the door, and I wasn't actually formally registered as living in the UK at the time. So, there's also a bit of data clearance, and being Danish, we haven't actually had a census for, I think, 50 years because we don't need to do it. Our population registry is 99.9% proof, so they do a sampling and they do a direct survey out with all these things on an annual basis. So again, different context means that your data methodology and your data collection may vary. And I think that's a key thing. But I agree that censuses can be one tool, but again, it's a snapshot every 10 years, and the data is already outdated the next day because things change, as you're saying. Anyway, Fabio, before we open up to and ask Carmen for any reflections online and then to the audience here, any thoughts?
No, yes, I agree with this discussion of the cycle. If you take, it's interesting because if you take, there's a very strong correlation between the GDP of countries and the availability of statistics on digital matters. So, and of course, you can ask, is because the statistics help countries to develop, or the other side, because they are developed, they have money to fund the statistics? I think it's both. And what Omnika was saying that I think is very key to us is sometimes with more segmentation you can make the green area very not green. So and one example is the discussion on meaningful connectivity in Brazil, because we had if you take our general figures, we are about to complete 90% of the population having online services or any connection to the internet. So you can say that the country is in a green line, that we only have 10% disconnected. But when you go to when you include devices and availability of the connection and affordability and skills and other things, our figure is much worse. So we only have 22% of the total population that we consider in our indicator with meaningful connectivity. So including these hidden gaps, this is also works for gender. So if you take if you take an overall picture, there's not much difference. There's not significant difference between women and men in terms of basic access to the internet. But when we go to the indicators of meaningful connectivity, we see a 10% gap in the country in comparison of women and men in terms of meaningful connectivity. So disclosing these gaps, I think it's very important for this type of
I think there's
but of course, the connection with good data and good policy is not immediate. So we understood this in CETIC, so that's why we do also capacity building along with UNU and other partners. We do capacity building for civil servants and other strategies, because we know that it's not sufficient to have good data, and the policies will get better immediately. So you need to invest also in this connection.
I think there's some interesting observations over the years on also statistical feedback that points in different directions. For instance, I think it was about 10 years ago, we were looking at second-generation digital divides from a strategical perspective, sort of in econometrics and statistical analysis. And in sub-Saharan Africa, there were more people with access to the internet than access to reliable electricity. And electricity is a precondition for charging your device and your router. So, you know, what does that mean? You need to dive into the context and see how many people have alternative access to electricity, but it's also quite a positive signal about how inventive people can be in order to assure they get access to something where they see a perceived value, which is something that we talked about earlier. Anyway, I'd like to just hand over to Carmen, who's our online moderator. She's also from the Global Digital Inclusion Partner Program. And Carmen, is there any observations or questions from the online audience that you'd like to bring to our attention? I think Carmen is saying something, but it's not coming up on the audio.
No.
Could we maybe turn up the sound for Carmen online?
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we have one question in the chat, which is, how can we ensure that the segmented data collection respects the privacy and dignity of marginalized communities?
Anyone from the panel that'd like to tackle that one? And in the meantime, if there's any questions for the audience, please raise your hand.
Yeah. So maybe everyone's looking at me because they know that I'm a lawyer. But let me start with that. I think that, I mean, there's many facets to this, and they aren't just the legal regulatory aspects. And so, you know, at the very outset, I suppose, in defining the data that you're collecting and understanding the value of the segmentation, it doesn't necessarily include personally identifiable information. And so in some ways you are freed from the data protection legislation or the privacy legislation to the extent that you are not collecting personally identifiable information. So I think that's the first cautionary. The element that's beyond just the legal and regulatory elements and the concerns around privacy and the perceptions around privacy and the willingness to participate in this, I think our methodological learning has been the value of having local participation in the collection of the data. And so what you need is also buy-in for the process, and I suppose to distinguish good data from bad data, that you've got a willing data provider that is willing to give you the data that you need. And so by using local researchers who are able to also deal with language gaps, understand maybe the concerns of the community in participating with, on such a survey, you're likely to address not just the privacy concerns, but the overall concerns about participation in the data collection itself.
Yeah, I would actually also say, just stepping away a little bit from even regulatory and legal issues, I think ethics, coming from a continent that, for the most part, we feel over-researched, there's sort of this gaze on Africa in general around, our way of living and all of that. It's really important to make sure that we are working with local partners, and not sort of coming in from a global organization to study these people. I mean, I think, we've got a history and a baggage that comes with that very, approach. And so maybe also just assuming a decolonized approach towards collecting the data, so that people consent, people understand also how we are going to utilize this data, and you bring them along so that they are part of the program as well and understand why you are collecting the data. I smiled a bit when you made the example about the number of people who are connected to the internet vis-a-vis the number of people with electricity, because I think one of the studies that raised a huge gasp was one that compared to the number of people with mobile phones and toothbrushes. And it's those type of narratives that, when we step back and look at them, like, what exactly are you trying to argue, in comparing number of mobile phones and number of toothbrushes? Because if anything, it actually exposed the ignorance of the researcher themselves, because there's other ways of keeping of dental health that's not just only your Western toothbrush and toothpaste kind of methodology, right? So local context is not just kind of coming in and taking me out for coffee and having a conversation with me over coffee, but it's also really about allowing me to also within the community lead some of that collecting of research. So we're not just kind of swooping in and having the consultants that we have, but empowering local communities also to be part of that data collection process as well.
Okay.
Yeah, no, just I think those questions are discussed a lot in the data community debates. We have UN has a UN data forum, which is a space where those types of topics are discussed, and it's interesting because there are some trends related to what my colleagues just said. For instance, there is a concept of citizen-generated data, which is now trendy in a lot of contexts, where in specific contexts you can have the citizens involved in the process of generating data with more quality, less costs, and so on. So this is a trendy. And another discussion that I think is relevant for this is that with the spread of mobile connections and increasing the number of internet users and digital platforms, there was a general expectation, especially among governments, that the problems of data will be solved because everybody is connected to some device and there will be traces. We know where people go, what they do online. And we have plenty of data. In a data-fied society, we have plenty of data. We don't need monitoring or surveys anymore because the problem is solved. And now the data community there's a pushback in the discussion. Okay, we need complementary sources of data. Sometimes we did not solve yet the thing of the digital platforms. Much of the data are private and not shared for policy purposes. So there's a discussion on how to access those type of data. Now you have satellites that provide other types of very interesting data and can be combined. So I think the data community is now in a process of, okay, we need to combine different sources to get the better solutions from citizen-generated data to more technological tools that can provide the best information you can for policy making.
Yeah. I just want to double check, is there anyone in the audience that have any observations or questions that they would like to highlight? If so, please feel free. I see no one moving. Is that, yes, please come up to the microphone. And please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kiho Oshima, and I'm a master's student in University of Bremen in Germany, and I'm studying digital media and society. And I was wondering, like you mentioned about privacy of citizens, and how do you see like the consent to the use of data for citizens, so especially those who are marginalized systematically? Like maybe there are people who, of course, would not like to share their data because of the sensitivity, and also there are cases like those data are used to profile them and expect like a criminals or something like that, and that's used in a way that reinforce marginalizations again. So how maybe would you consider like including digital rights education and also providing like opt-in and opt-out options so that they know that not only their rights but also how to exercise their rights? Or would that be too big scale or to implement or something like that? And another thing is, so how do we prevent the use of segmented data to be interpreted or used in the way that could reinforce? So when we use data, how do you prevent and those kind of use in a way that would reinforce marginalization?
Yeah.
Yes, I would like to.
Excellent questions, I think. Particularly, we can start with the privacy, but I particularly like the sort of how do we use data so we don't reinforce insisting patterns of exclusion, for instance, is really, really interesting. Anyone want to?
No, if you want to. I think these are very good questions. From the perspective of privacy, we have a very interesting survey that we did with individuals in Brazil, asking them about what they perceive about their privacy online and data protection and so on. This survey is very interesting because from one side, there's a growing concern among citizens about how the data are collected and used. The main topic in the case of Brazil is facial recognition, for instance, or when there are this type of data collection is considered the one that they are more concerned, and also health data. So health data is ultra sensitive, and people feel worried about those two particular types of sensitive data. But it's also interesting that still there is not much literacy on understanding how digital platforms collect data from people. So there's more concern regarding, for instance, financial frauds or something that has to do with payments than when you go to a social media and put your photos and so there's not much understanding of how this model of data collection works. But when it comes to financial data and frauds, they are more concerned because it's very objective.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at addressing or collecting data to address the digital divide, do we need that level of that type of personal data, as in what have I paid for, what is my health data?
No.
We do not, do we?
Yes, I think there are two different. Traditionally, typically in the data for policies collected, you have anonymized data, even for survey or for administrative. You know, for in Denmark, you know that you have a so sophisticated administrative data that you even don't need to ask people things because you have.
It becomes a political risk assessment, whether or not we want to use it.
And there's a discussion. There are different solutions. Whether in some countries you cannot ask for ethnicity issues because there is concern of this can. So each society will have the different solutions. I can speak about the case of Brazil. There is not a distrust, a necessary distrust, when you provide information to the government. For instance, we have a very important social income program that is national, and to be in this program, you need the government needs to know where the poor people are. So there is distrust. In some cases, you have to provide data. Is also the case of public health. So public health data can ensure that you focusing on the right person, but there are some discussions on what type of data need to be collected and
because that's a very interesting topic for discussion on access to actual opportunities through technology, access to banking services online, accesses to the benefit of shopping online, government services online, and that's an very interesting element. But to continue.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I like that question because I think that it's important for us, especially in platforms like this, to continue to raise awareness about this as a major concern for digital consumers in particular. And I mean, I think it's an indication of the trust deficit that exists even amongst all of the stakeholders under even an entity like IGF, for example, right? And a big, one example I will give is during COVID-19, most countries adopted COVID-19 tracking apps where you were encouraged to download something on your phone. I just know that for a lot of people in my country personally, we've learned that after we signed up for something related to COVID-19, we started receiving SMSs from a particular political party for the next local election campaigns that happened immediately after COVID-19. So there definitely is that bridge of data privacy, right? But what I also want to encourage us as digital rights advocates is that when it comes to data, the offline and the online should not be any different. All of us probably, I don't think it happened here in Norway, but in most countries, when we visit and you check in at a hotel, including in your own country, the receptionist takes your passport and makes a photocopy of it. And you leave that photocopy of your passport behind when you check out, right? You know, let's ask this question around data privacy and safety, even in these offline instances where a security officer at a building asks for a copy of your passport or your ID number and all of that, because all of those are interrelated and they're not just unique to data. And I think we'll make better progress in educating people around also protecting themselves in terms of their data. But in as far as the data collected for research, GDIP as well uses anonymized data, so there's really no way to be able to track who or what. But you know, certainly from an exclusion and location point of view, certain communities could come out as vulnerable, right? And I think we need to be honest and open to exploring some of that. The challenge, though, is that if you don't count it, then it really doesn't exist, and no one has the opportunity to actually address some of these gaps.
Yeah. Priya, you've been indicating you have something to say here, so I'll let you continue on this track.
This is so close to, I suppose, the work that excites me the most, and it's in the data for good space. And I think your question really, for me, triggered this question about data for good or data for bad, and how do we manage that? And so, we said that this kind of data might fall outside of the data protection kind of regulatory space. But I want to say that even for non-personal data, there is no reason why we can't exercise some of those standards that we would apply to personal data. And so, if you're collecting personal data, you are limited by the purpose for which you collected it, and you need to use it within those confines of why you collected it. You've got to uphold certain security standards. You've got to exercise a level of restraint and collect only what you need. And so there are valid principles that can be taken into how we do this kind of work. Because to Fabio's point about the technology running away from us and citizen-generated data, we have to get very serious about not just personal data protection, but the protection of data sets, even the aggregated ones, because there are those harms attached to it, and there are those opportunities also linked to it. And so something that we're working on is just trying to understand, in the way that the data sets are compiled and made available, and the value that sits in them, who actually gets value from it, and what about the citizen and the communities that have contributed their data? To what extent can they also then have access to it? So one of the questions we can ask ourselves is that, have we meaningfully engaged with the community when we receive the results? To have a conversation with them about what this means and the decision set that they have to improve their digital inclusion, characterization. And so do we take that data back to them, and do we allow them to use it? There may be budding entrepreneurs in the communities. And, once they have access to this data, to know who's connected and using what, maybe there's some level of enterprise that can emerge locally. There are many cases like this where we have to force ourselves to think about, when we have the data, what do we do with it? And have we created a pathway to go back to the community and back to the citizen and make sure some of those benefits sit there? I think Annika and Fabio mentioned in some ways that the digital inclusion problem globally in the development world is big business. And so in some ways, we've got a willing buyer for this kind of data. But I think that doesn't excuse us from the freedom to say, how can we use this data responsibly, but also to get value locally from the data?
There was actually do you have a follow-up?
No, it's really intriguing to me that to balance approaching marginalized groups, and to do that, we need to use the data, but at the same time, they need to be protected because they are marginalized at the same time. And I think I'm really intrigued to see this balance and how it will be realized, or maybe it's really difficult, because even for me, looking at terms and conditions, I would skip, or I would not read every sentence, but I also think that those design can be improved, so it's really user-friendly, and I would just see in one side that, okay, this I would want to say yes, but this no, for cookies. Yes.
It's interesting. It comes back to that layering of data, I think, and there was an interesting example here in Norway a couple of years ago where the journalists at the national broadcasters went and bought data from the World Wide Web, marketing data from social media, from the banks, etc., and they could basically layer it, and they identified a Ministry of Defense employer to his local commute to and from his home, his place of work, who he was married to, where his kids get to school, when he dropped off the kids, and when the wife dropped off the kids. And it was really interesting in terms of that anonymized data, but when you have a specific objective in mind and you start layering, they could actually identify those type of patterns from this individual. I mean, it was obviously a journalistic investigation, but it raises some concern even around anonymized data. But how do we take and build that into some of these sort of regional and global frameworks? How much data do we need also to compare ourselves, country to country or region to region, city to city? What are the type of experiences and the type of data sets that you would say are really key in order to ensure that we get as many people online so they can enjoy the opportunities of the World Wide Web and similar, while minimizing the negative impacts of the data collection?
I would add to that. I mean, I think this brings us back to former years like around open data, right? So do I need to still collect the same data if Research ICT Africa has collected the data for a community? So they may be looking at, you know, beyond access in terms of digital skills, but I might be interested in something closely related to that, maybe women specifically, but they've disaggregated their data, they've collected the data. I think the other question is, how do we leverage existing data sets amongst organizations by standardizing the collection to make sure that it's, you know, we've got this fragmentation of disaggregation of populations and all these factors, so that not everyone has to collect the same data from the same group of people as well.
It's a very interesting challenge. We had this discussion with our colleagues at CETIC in Brazil when we were doing a study on youth and young adults, so the under 18-year-olds, and what digital service transformation meant for them. And in Brazil, young adults were defined as 13 to 18-year-olds, whereas in Europe, it's 15 to 18-year-olds. So, you know, there was some data variation. And we see the same actually in some internal research we're doing on the digital gender divide, where even if there is data collection by research teams, they segment it, they do excellent work, excellent data collection, but they forgot to use the same age groups as, for instance, the National Statistical Data Agency, which means that it makes their data work and their data analysis more time-consuming or less impactful because there were some small mistakes or small missed opportunities in alignment of data from different sources. So are there some national, regional, or even global sort of standards or rules of thumb that you would recommend when it comes to segmentation? We've talked about age and income levels. We've talked about activities online. Are there any ones that you think are almost like universal that you would recommend that you look at?
No, what I can comment is that I agree with you. There are different levels of data that you can, and at CETIC we try to do both. So for one side, there's a global discussion on minimal standards of data. There's the UN Partnership on Measuring ICT for Development, which set minimum rules for, and because of that, we can compare data from Brazil and other countries. So we more or less follow these international standards, and there are debates on what to measure and how to measure, including a list of disaggregations. I've also mentioned the G20 case where there are also recommendations for disaggregating the meaningful connectivity data. So this is at the global level. But what I think is important is that different from the past, when we normally have all the data from one country concentrated in one national institute of statistics or institution. Nowadays, there's an ecosystem of data. The data is not only in public settings, but also in civil society, in the private sector. And coordinating these efforts, I think it's key. And And also within governance, sometimes we have silos that don't talk to each other. So educational data is not linked to financial data, and you cannot cross this type of thing. So there's so more or less we believe that this discussion on an ecosystem that manages data that is not only public but public and private. It's key for making solutions, and of course. The data that one municipality wants for planning urban mobility is totally different from a national Ministry of Education planning.
Exactly.
So this type of granularity will come depending on the policy need you have.
Okay. Priya or Nika?
Yeah. It's very clear from the discussion we're having today that even though it's not broad-based, the segmentation work is reaching a particular level of sophistication and maturity. But as Annika mentioned, we're not comparing notes. And so the opportunity, if there was any kind of regional collaboration or there was an initiative at a global level, is to bring the key players together to understand the different methodologies, and UNESCO has set up some tools and indicator sets that can be leveraged. But what is it that has come from this qualitative work and from these unique combinations that we mentioned and these intersections that also add to those frameworks that exist, and how can we develop it so that the data is more reliable and more accessible? But I think what we're being challenged to do as an organization now is make the data more accessible to people who have questions that we never conceived of.
Yeah.
And I think to also anticipate that they aren't researchers and they aren't policy experts, but they will have very unique requirements from the data set. And how can you create something that is accessible and allows them to use that data in ways that you haven't conceived of? So imagining that it's going beyond this community and is being used in new ways, because that's what we're seeing now, that we can't really identify how the data will be used, but we want to make it accessible for uses that we didn't conceive of. I want to exercise, I suppose, some caution, I would say, in bringing the data together. I think it needs to be very deliberate and very well-intentioned, because there's the potential and propensity there for massive harm if the data is, brought together in ways that we lose that element of control or accountability for why we initially put the data together. And there's so many examples where data lakes have gone badly, and it introduces just a range of vulnerabilities. So it isn't. I'm not sharing an excitement to bring all the data together without thinking through very carefully what is the process that we use, and how do we get a little more adaptive, I suppose, in the way that
we hear some very interesting reflections also from policymakers and civil servants including in regions like East Africa, where you have these massive drives for data lakes, but without having a data classification scheme that says this is data that you can easily rely on because it's high quality. This is not as high quality because that defines how will I interpret the results, how reliable is the data, but also can I layer this data with other data in terms of privacy, security, etc. Is coming up from the organizations within the public sector in East Africa itself, because they see that they've sometimes made the wrong decisions.
Exactly.
Not for bad intention, but because the data was not of the quality they thought it was. Or it couldn't be compared because it was defined differently. So there is some really interesting self-reflections, both in the global north, because in Denmark we've had the same reflections in the public sector about the reliability of the data, but also in emerging economies where data is available, but are we sure of the quality? to make the right decisions. So that's a really interesting dialogue. Onika?
Yeah, I just want to share an example of just one of the exercises we did in Ghana several years ago, and that was to create a data and research working group where they mainly focused on kind of mapping where existing ICT data was within the country, so that as researchers, they kind of talk to each other, they know who has what data and what frequency, how frequent is that data updated, including some level of success at bringing some of the operators, the mobile operators in, because they are obviously also sitting with tons of data that we may or may not find useful, right? But it wasn't about bringing all the data in one place, but just really having a sense of a mapping of, who has what data, and, being able to also negotiate some openness for researchers who may be interested in doing research and looking at particular issues, to be able to know, where they can rely on. It also reduces the size of household surveys that you have to do when you realize that you don't need 40 questions because this particular operator, the 3 operators within the country can tick off maybe 10 of those.
I'm loving that, because it was actually the topic of some recommendations CETIC and UNUEGov did in a G20 policy brief last year under the Brazilian presidency, as in 155 countries, you must present legal identity in order to get a mobile phone or internet connection. Is there ways and models that we can use that and the telco licensing for the telco providers to provide us a snapshot on gender, on age groups, on basic elements that are anonymized to the telco regulators, so they get that snapshot, but then also provide certain usage data, like on certain types of IP addresses, like online commerce, banking, again, so you get that data in snapshots, but anonymized, to create sort of the initial heat maps, lower the burden of data collection, that then allows you to also dive into the context of the green flashing lights, but it's a new model. And with the telco regulators, you can potentially create those type of partnerships by making it part of your operational responsibility to provide certain types of data so decision makers can address the digital divide and spend more time on diving into the specific challenges in the context rather than these blanket decisions. So there are some potential models at play there. I would just checking the audience to see if there's another set of questions before I raise the last question to the audience. I've seen online, there's no more questions online, but if you were going to do one recommendations that you would ideally like to see happen in the segmentation of data collection to address the digital divide, to make those better decisions, what would that one recommendation be for the next 12 months?
Well, I can start. This is a very difficult question, but I think there's one thing that we kind of discussed, but I would like to reinforce, is that for a long time, that's because we do mostly surveys or that we interview one individual. So we try to think about digital inclusion as an individual characteristic. So you take gender and age and all these factors, and you think we are talking about individuals. But most of the problems are collective problems. So there's lots of discussion on community networks, how communities can build innovative models for digital inclusion. Schools are also important in this debate. We have in Brazil, we have libraries as one of the most spread public infrastructure that are also need to be engaged. So I do think that try to think more in collective measures or collective exercise to understand better the situation. One small example, in this meaningful connectivity study, apart from having one indicator, does the household has a computer, which is a traditional indicator that everybody measure, we decided to calculate, okay, but if the household has one person and one computer, you are okay. But if you have one computer and 10 people living there fighting from the same device, what will be the quality of the use? So we decided to calculate a ratio of people per device, or you can do this with income. What's the percentage of the income of the device that is? So this type of things thinks the household as a collective of people rather than individuals. So I think facing the collective challenges is useful for policy in digital inclusion.
Yep.
I won't answer the question, but I'll just pick up on what you just said around, looking at household v. individual, and that's because we actually did an evaluation of a model, a subsidy model of 1 tablet per household in Uganda, which was very successful. They focused mainly on female-led households, used USF funds to actually provide a tablet per household. And very interesting stories, please do look it up on our website, on how that actually helped to empower, the least suspected subject for that intervention. And, even though the focus was mainly with the women in the households, it's the children who actually benefited the most, and it's education that was highly impacted by that initiative. So I really like that notion that, it's really important for us to also just sort of look at communities the way they are organized.
I mean, there were some interesting discussions between the ITU and the Arab region's technical working group for statistics, where actually the recommendations from the Arab group on the definition of a household got changed by ITU, because it was based on a traditional nuclear family, global north concept, and not on multi-generational or alternative household structures that you see all over the world, even in the global north. So it was really, really interesting in that regard. But I'm taking away the time from Priya to either address the same question or come up with an actionable suggestion for the next 12 months.
Yeah, maybe I suppose maybe put differently, what is the question that keeps me up at night for this kind of work? And I would say it's about the sustainability of the work and the adaptation maybe of methodologies and how we do it. And I mean, it takes a long time, and it's quite costly, and to do it well, you've got to really have the local participation and so on. So how do we build on the current methodologies, and how do we make it more sustainable? And how do we make sure that there's continued interest in the process to get this data? Because there's high levels of interest in the data, but not always in the process to collect the data. And linked to that sustainability question for me is then, what is the compelling way in which we approach the sharing and exchange of data? And as you spoke about the opportunity with the telecoms firms, I would say to you the biggest challenge, because they would probably be doing that analysis already and have all that kind of segmentation there. They have different reasons for it. But to get them to share it as data for good, how do we present a compelling case to them? And so how do we build those incentive structures? And if we don't figure that out, I feel that this work will not be sustainable, because it will be replaced by quicker technical measures that don't necessarily have the rigor attached to it. So yes, we've got to balance innovation with some of the traditional methodologies. We've got to adapt it. But how are we going to do that to make sure we don't ever lose these insights.
Yeah. Thank you. Just to try and summarize a little bit on the key takeaways that I've seen is that there's a general consensus that we need better segmented data around gender, income levels, location, education, and so forth. But there's also a recognition that will only get us so far. To address the digital divide, we need to then go down and analyze the contextual, which becomes, to paraphrase Onika, is more of a qualitative assessment. It is not a statistical empirical assessment. And there's also, I think, more or less a consensus on the panel and with the audience that, yes, we need to balance this sort of anonymization with privacy when we start layering data across different elements. And then lastly, that there are some opportunities for different type of partnerships for data collection, both with the private sector, particularly telcos, but also with local communities, and getting them involved in driving the decisions in order to also target the more tailored initiatives that will include them and give them the opportunities for being digitally included and benefit from that. And there is some interesting sort of user segmentation divides in there that doesn't just go by gender or income level or marginalization, but are cross-cutting. I forgot what you called it, Priya.
Intersectional.
Intersectional, both on the divide and the inclusion. With that note, I'd like to thank the audience and the panel for your time and details. We will be summarizing the discussion of this panel and provide it online in the next couple of weeks. Obviously, the panelists will have a chance to also comment on that draft, but we'll be sharing that. In the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us or to our organizations if you have further questions. The information details, at least to the websites of all the organizations, both present here and those who unfortunately couldn't join us because of airline logistics. Thank you very much, and enjoy the next couple of days of IGF.
Thank you.